I mean, I believe Donnie Yen wanted me to be an Ip Man because he knew that I was going to help him do what we needed to do less painfully and quicker. Because if you have to do 10, 20 takes because the other guy you're doing it with can't get it right, that's miserable. It's not easy. It seemed like a good idea when I was 12. Turns out it's difficult.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Pantheon Plus. My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Twitter at Jerome C. 1985. This week, we are going to be discussing the fourth and final Yip Man movie. My co-host for this week and every week is Brian. You can find him on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. You can find our podcast on Twitter at Hero Pantheon. Please leave a 4 or 5 star review so as to help people discover the great work that the folks at the Real World are doing and the work that we are doing here with Superhero Pantheon and Pantheon Plus. Here we are going to be again discussing Yip Man 4. Next week we will be doing kind of a bonus episode before we transition into a new theme for the month of June, which I believe we've been teasing, but we'll definitely get into that at the end of the episode. But for right now, Brian, let's talk about the fourth and final Yip Man. Kind of a weird movie in a lot of ways. You get to see how some of the folks in Hong Kong interpret Americans. And I have to say, Brian, one of the worst scenes that I've seen in a movie in a long time happens here. And I want to get this conversation over with now because it really doesn't have anything to do with the plot of the movie. I guess it involves one of the primary characters. But what ends up happening is you get this young woman who kind of becomes a mentee of Yip Man. And she is a cheerleader, Vanda Margraf playing Yona Wan, and Miss Wan is a cheerleader. And there's this cheerleading scene, and it literally sounds like dialogue that was put through Google Translate and then came out the other side. It wasn't even. It just I wanted to crawl out of my own body because it was so bad.
Listen. Some of these American accents, English speaking in this movie, it feels like literally being read off like a teleprompter or a page right in front of the person and has no life to it. There's no character to it. They're just reading lines, man. So that's what kind of got me about these American characters. And it's, I'm not bothered by the racism because it's 1964 and that shit was really going on. And, it was 1964 in San Francisco. Go figure. So, but yeah, it just threw me through a loop. I don't know. It just kind of was like, oh my god, like they got cringe dialogue going on, and there's more English speaking in this movie than the previous 3 movies. And again, it's this idea where we're gonna cast people who are not exactly Americans. They're British or Australian or whatever. They got to cover their accents. We can dub them in later. But their performance doesn't really matter. They're just placements there because they fit the role. You know what I mean? They fit that bill of a white person from America. So we're just going to put them in the movie. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at in terms of the casting. I mentioned that cheerleader scene to you. I texted you this scene does not belong in the movie at all. But yeah. And then in terms of the girl, I'm going to go on a whole rant about that because I think they cut a storyline from her that was really important to her character and her dad's character because her dad is a kung fu master that doesn't want Bruce Lee to teach kung fu or Wing Chun to, Americans or Westerners, yet somehow he has a daughter that's half white.
Yeah, it's really bizarre. I mean, she comes across as being half white, and I will say she gets one of the more interesting and provocative lines that I've heard in a Yip Man movie because she's being yelled at by these white cheerleaders. And it is important to note that they are white because of what she says. She basically critiques the entire idea of America by criticizing the fact that all of our indigenous people were murdered by white people. I was stunned. You would never hear that in an American movie, but to just hear it thrown off like that, like clearly this is a point in the movie when they're doing a lot of propaganda. But I was stunned because you just don't hear that in an American movie. The fact that you would hear such a loud critique of the fact that Americans murdered so many indigenous people. It's wild, man.
I mean, I'm used to that because in my high school, I was in the magnet program, and we extensively talked about like the genocides of many Native American tribes. Trail of Tears, look that up. That's fucking awful. A lot has gone on. And when she said that, I was like, well, she's not wrong. Like, she's just not wrong. And I'm just like, I agree. Like, she's not wrong. And then, like, you know, the kids are just looking at her like, how dare you say that or whatever. And it's like, boy, you have no idea. But I was like, I was kind of smiling a little bit when she threw that line out there. I'm not gonna lie. Like, that's one of the few shining moments of the movie where I was like, oh, here we go. That's not a lie.
So there is a little bit of controversy surrounding this movie as during the 2019 Hong Kong protests, the protesters urged a boycott of the movie because Donnie Yen, Danny Chen, and producer Raymond Wong have very pro-Beijing stances. And yeah, I certainly don't blame the protesters. I mean, just like so many other celebrities, they have awful politics. And this is not a political show, but it is worth pointing that out because it's kind of the reality. And I think it's important to understand where these folks are coming from. Like, this is definitely in some ways, I think the most pro-China movie of them all. And I think it's because they're coming up against the United States, which also in a lot of ways is even more nationalistic in terms of portrayal and attitude and whatnot. So I think you kind of get the response to that. And I also just want to point out that this movie earned significantly more on its first day of release than The Rise of Skywalker. I'm taking it anyway.
Well, I like Rise of Skywalker, so there you go. I guess I'm gonna die on that hill to the day I die, and you know what? I'm proud of that.
Anyway, so this movie, while it is centered around the style of Wing Chun and Bruce Lee, bringing a previous student of Yip Man, Lee eventually abandoned this style after his infamous secret underground fight against Wong Jackman in 1964. Just like this movie correctly portrays, the Chinese martial arts community was displeased with Lee teaching non-Chinese students Wing Chun and flew in Wong Jackman to challenge Lee in a trial by combat to determine if Lee can be allowed to continue teaching. After the fight, Lee concluded Wing Chun had limitations and sought to create his own style called Jeet Kune Do, way of the intercepting fist. This is why Lee's fighting style in the karate scene is noticeably different than some of the other fight scenes in this movie. So I like that. I mean, I think one of your criticisms, which was justified, is just how technical Donnie Yen was when doing the Wing Chun. And I think it actually kind of pays off in some ways because you do get Bruce Lee incorporating a new style that is perhaps more aggressive, a little bit more violent. So I think that is worth pointing out and very interesting.
Yeah, I think this was in the Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, right? I'm pretty sure they showed that fight. Like, I haven't seen that movie in a while, but I saw it a lot as a kid. And I very much recall that whole, like, controversy in that movie. And I even texted Jerome at the beginning of this movie, like, oh, they're setting up that movie. Like, they're setting up Bruce Lee's death already. Because, I'm sorry, he wasn't assassinated. But, you know, he died of quote-unquote natural causes. Quote-unquote.
Brian, we are not indulging in conspiracy theories around Bruce Lee's death.
I know, we spoke about it during Enter the Dragon, but I'm just mentioning that now because, you know, people are thinking about it. But, hey, if you didn't watch the beginning, if you didn't at least think that in the beginning of this movie, they were talking about Bruce Lee, like, you know, it's like, you know, something was up, man, whatever. But, and they clearly implied it here, even though they kind of forgave him at the end of the movie. But there's still people out there that were pissed at what he was doing. And it was, you know, it's you know, an underlying race thing too, and that kind of ties into this whole anti-American thing that they got on here. But it's not necessarily totally anti-American. There are some Americans that are on their side, and they kind of portray him as kind of weak though, and kind of like soft. But that's just another perspective, I guess. But yeah, they tried, and I don't know. This movie, I feel it's not all over the place necessarily. I just feel like they couldn't figure out the villain. And then once they figured out, okay, who do we figure out is going to be the villain for the final battle? Once they set that up, it was like, okay, I guess. But then you kind of just wasted time at this school. You kind of just wasted time with the INS. And we don't even get that storyline resolved or whatever. And the poor girl is just going to get tortured the next day, apparently, at school. And there's no resolution to that either.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird movie. I think there's a lot of threads that are set up, and then nothing kind of pays off. I mean, I think the first 15 minutes, it's all about Yip Man struggling to connect with his son, and then he gets a cancer diagnosis, and instead of, again, I want to point this out, and I understand that he is going to America specifically to find a school for his son. So I understand that there's that context, but literally at the end of the third movie, the point that Yip Man makes is that it is more important to spend time with your family than to compete. Brian, what happens in the fourth movie?
He goes away from his family and competes. So that's pretty much the opposite.
And again, I understand like what his purpose was, but it's bordering on self-parody at this point. The fact that this keeps happening, and it's a strange movie. I think I was more entertained by parts of this movie than the third one, just because I was really listening to those accents closely and listening for slippage, of which there was a lot, because all of these English-speaking actors, none of them are American, and these are all people that I've never seen or heard from, and probably, unless I am watching other Hong Kong movies, probably am not seeing or hearing from otherwise. There's a lot of British, there's a lot of Australian, so it's not a movie that necessarily works. And Brian, I have to tell you, I have been to the San Francisco Chinatown. This is nothing like the San Francisco Chinatown.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's an outsider's perspective, right? And look, it's not on location. It's all giant sets, and they do that for all the other movies too. It's not. I mean, they probably go on location on some of the other movies, but you can tell, like, especially the first one, when I was talking about quote unquote Kung Fu Alley with all those different schools together, that was like a giant, multiple sets coming together kind of thing. So yeah, this movie is just like, I don't know. It feels like it wants to be a drama, but then it's forced to be an action movie by the end of it because it's a Yeet Man movie. Like, it feels like the beginning, or maybe the whole movie, should have just been him and his son struggling to find the relationship and rebuild that relationship together. But it's almost as if the girl from America was being used as a way for him to kind of like get a perspective of his relationship with his son, in a way that her relationship kind of mirrors the relationship with her father, except that, I guess Yeet Man doesn't want his son to learn martial arts. But by the end of the movie, he just accepts it because he looks at the way that this little girl fights to be accepted by her father, and then he realizes maybe I should just accept my son for what he wants to do. I get the whole message. It's like you could have done such a better job with it and actually have him and his son together in scenes, as opposed to his son just brushing him off all the time because he's pissed off at him.
Well, there's also this idea that the grass isn't always greener, too. And even though this movie is taking place in 1964, I think there is very clearly a contemporary message of, we don't need to send all of our people to the West to better themselves, to get a better education, because there is a threat of racism. And I have no doubt that there are aspects of this that were true in 2019, but in the year 2023, after the pandemic, after COVID, after the numerous crimes that were committed, are still being committed against people of Asian descent, I mean, I could absolutely see this being a real thing. And I think it is a legitimate talking point. I think it is very much couched in this pro-China rhetoric, but I think there are certainly aspects of it are true. And I have to say, I mentioned the shock of hearing them talk about just the murdering of Native Americans, but there's also a lot of use of specific words that are derogatory about Asian people, words that I will not repeat. But I mean, they go pretty hard. I mean, just in terms of the specific words that are used, referring to the color of their skin, using a very specific derogatory term about China. I know that in the Vietnam War, they would also often refer to the Viet Cong as a very specific term, beginning with the letter G, that they also use that word. So just this movie really goes hard. And again, not all the American characters are bad, but boy, oh boy, this movie comes very hard against the United States military and kind of the systemic racism of this country.
What I found interesting was the black characters. Like, they're portrayed as like not going through a struggle themselves, even though they're clearly going through a struggle themselves. And the one black character on the police force, he's just kind of like, I don't know. It's almost as if he's kind of playing this weak person, and he's trying to like he doesn't stand up for himself. He's not outspoken, but it feels like he should be speaking out. And I don't even know how he got on the INS and how he's part of like the Wing Chun school and the guy. I don't know. There was some weird gaps in logic there, but I don't know. I just felt like they could have done more with that poor black character, and like they just used him almost as like a token character, and that sucks. But like, I don't know. They set him up to do something, and he really didn't do anything at all. It's like, why even have him there? Like, you're trying to do this, like, you know, commentary on race, and you got this black character that's there, and you're doing nothing with him, and he's not, you know, he's not being like. I mean, I'm sure that character probably went through a lot of, like, obviously in 64, a lot of racism, but we don't see that, and it's just implied that, like, he's just another American. So I don't know what was going on there, and it just seems like a missed opportunity, or they casted him to kind of, you know, ride that line, but not totally go over the line. You know what I mean? So I don't know. And I mean, they certainly talk about racism with the Chinese people, but there was some commentary there with the black community that they were just not like touching, but they were just like, we'll have a black character or two in the movie, but we're not going to like touch on their struggles. And I thought, well, there's a really, you know, you can kind of cross that over and have them like, you know, because like you can even tell that almost to kind of tell the story with like the Kareem Abdul-Jabbar thing and having black students, and that was kind of like another subtle thing they were trying to like say about, you know, not teaching to Westerners. And I was like, oh, they don't want to teach black people. They don't like black people. And then they didn't really touch upon that. And, you know, they kind of touch more upon it in the Dragon Bruce Lee story. So it's very weird on what they wanted to talk about in terms of race in this movie.
Yeah, they have no problem critiquing the American racism, but they don't want to complicate it and talk about their own racism, which is a very real thing. As I'm sure many black people who've gone to China and Hong Kong and other Asian countries could speak to. I mean, white is seen as kind of the idealized skin color, I think, in a lot of ways. And I think many Asian people will get their skin pigmented to be lighter, in fact. And that is a very real thing. And I'm not saying this isn't the case for everyone, but I think the race dynamics of Hong Kong are perhaps a little bit more complicated than this movie wants to portray. So one of the threads that kind of gets paid off from all the other movies is we've seen Yip Man do a lot of smoking, and here he is diagnosed with throat cancer because of the smoking. His doctor tells him to stop, and he doesn't. He just keeps right on smoking.
Well, here's the thing. Here's the problem. At the end of the movie, it's his head and neck cancer. So I don't know what he actually died from.
Yeah. They sure are cagey about that.
Yeah, I don't know, because it's clear that it's because of the smoking, but they only said head and neck cancer to cover up the fact that it was the smoking. Like, just say it was throat cancer because it's clear what it is.
I don't know. I mean, that may be a translation issue. I don't know. Yeah,
I don't know. Maybe it's an accident, but I felt like they were trying to cover up the fact that he made the conscious decision to put that into his body. You know what I mean? Like, it's his decision, obviously, anyone's decision to smoke a cigarette, but the consequences of it all, it felt like they were, you know, kind of not giving the fact that the consequences of what his actions were, and they just kind of make it seem like he's a victim of circumstance.
All right, so let's get to the meat and potatoes of the movie. Is eventually we are in San Francisco. Yip Man is in San Francisco, and we find this group of Marines, and this group of Marines, they're just debating whether they want to use Chinese Kung Fu or Chinese martial arts as part of their training in the Marines. And you get a couple of characters, most notably played by Scott Adkins. He plays Barton Geddes, a corrupt racist U.S. Marine Corps gunnery sergeant and karate expert. So there is him in this movie. We get to see, he was also in the most recent John Wick. We also get Chris Collins playing Colin Frater, who is also a racist U.S. Marine Corps sensei. The final fight is between Frater and Yip Man, but I do think that one of the highlights, in fact, was actually getting to see Yip Man fight Scotty Adkins, again playing Barton Geddes. And what was probably the best fight scene, again, just like in the previous movie, I don't think the best fight scene was at the end.
In terms of the fighting, it's a mixed bag. I did like the stuff at the festival. That looked really good with the crowd there. I don't know. It feels like the place where they filmed the finale and that other fight that they filmed there on that, like that blue gym mat, whatever, in that military complex or whatever. It looked like a giant green screen stage, and it threw me off completely. Like the one in the festival looked really good because that's a real stage, but for some reason they chose this giant green screen. You could tell it's green screen because there's so much like empty space, and it's looks so digital in the background, and the background doesn't even look real. But they had people sit in the background, but I don't know, because you can tell it's green screen. I was like, why are they doing this? Like, just do a regular set, and it's not a COVID thing because this came out in 2019. So I don't know what was going on there. Like they just had this idea that we had to do more green screen, especially at the end. It just was like, why are we doing that? And then, well, I mean, Scott Adkins is, he was great in John Wick 4. I'm going to say that now. And, in this movie, he doesn't have the great accent that he did in John Wick 4, but the American accent he's doing is very, typical. But, I don't know, it was a good performance, but I think it's probably the best American performance we got in this whole movie compared to the other performances. And I guess he was kind of going over the top, but I mean, in terms of to build up an evil villain for the finale, it works because compared to the third movie, you really didn't get that. It was more of this, clash of two noble warriors. In this case, it's like a giant asshole going up against Yeet Man. So that's kind of where I'm at on that, and it kind of works. But everything leading up to that is just kind of again, just too much going on. But I do think Scott Adkins did a really great job, and he definitely has the physicality of the role, and he really has that size to him that works. And yeah, I mean, even though his logic is not sound whatsoever in terms of getting revenge, makes no sense whatsoever. But again, it's this idea that we gotta beat up the masters of all the other kung fu styles and then make Wing Chun look super over at the end. I get it. It's just a recurring thing now, but it just sucks for all the other kung fu masters, especially the one dude, I forget his name, Master Wang, I think, from the first movie, who comes back as the old friend in this movie, and he gets his ass kicked again for the fourth time, I think.
Yeah, he's kind of the jobber of the group, I guess, right? That's what it comes down to.
That sucks because he's the head of a school and he's such a jobber. But again, it's this idea that we have to put Wing Chun over as the grand thing.
He moved to the United States and still ends up jobbing out.
Yeah, that was he opened up another school there, and still I don't know. At that point I would have just gave up after the first movie and just moved on to something else. But he stuck with his style, and I guess he made money from it, so it worked for a little bit.
Yes, very very clearly. Yeah, I think this is kind of a movie that I think it's an interesting watch, but I think it is a clear step down from the quality of the first two movies. In my view, I would say this is a step up from the first one, though. I know you are kind of the opposite.
Yeah, it just feels like we're just rehashing stuff, you know what I mean? And then, again, this idea that we're going to abandon the plot of the first 45 minutes and just go with something else. Because that's exactly what they did. The girl that accuses and, kind of tortures the Chinese girl, there's no follow-up to that, right? We know that her parents are racist and they want to get rid of all the Chinese people and just, you work for the INS, just get rid of them, honey. And, yeah, that bullshit. And it goes nowhere. And there was no revenge or comeuppance or whatever. I wanted to see that girl get fucking, slapped or something or get caught. But no, there's no repercussions for her lying that, that she was assaulted when in reality it was a gang ganging up on the little girl and cutting her hair against her will and doing all this mean shit. She reminds me of the blonde girl from the Chucky series that kind of has that arc towards season 2 that kind of turns her baby face, but still I'm a little hesitant on that character from Chucky. So that's kind of the vibes I get from her, and I'm just I don't trust you, and it's not because you're blonde. It's just you're acting like an asshole, and I really don't like you right now, but they never get their comeuppance, and that kind of bothered me.
Yeah, that of course connects to the awful, awful cheerleading scene. And yeah, I don't think that this movie ever really comes together, which it's weird. It feels like the first two movies you had very much like, okay, the first 30 minutes is this one thing and then it becomes something else. And I feel like it worked in those cases. And with these two movies, it feels like there are threads that are just being completely left behind as well. So I think that for me is what is the problem. And I think that there are positive things about what this movie does. And I think in terms of the cinematography, I think there's some good stuff. I think this movie probably looks the best of the four. I think there's a lot of colors. I don't know if maybe if we're going for like, okay, this is a movie that takes place in the 1960s, so we want this movie to look like it actually took place in the 60s. I don't know if that contributes, but I think you have a lot more colors. I think you have a lot more well shot action, even though the action maybe isn't as good, but I think it looks good. And yeah, I think the cinematography, I think in some ways was perhaps the best of the four.
I think I'd agree with that. For some reason, the second one still sticks out with me just because they use turquoise, and that's kind of rare in movies. In this case, if you look at the blue on the cheerleaders' uniform, it's very much like a normal kind of blue. So they kind of went with a normal color kind of palette, I guess. They didn't really do anything kind of crazy with the color palette. It was safe. It was fine. The lighting was good compared to that first movie just really was just like I think a mistake shooting it that way. But in comparison to the later movies, obviously the correct decisions were made later on. And it's 1964. That's what they're going for. I really picked up on that when they were in the diner earlier in the movie with Bruce Lee. I thought that was like, oh, that's definitely like a 60s diner, and I was digging that. And then I don't know. I feel like that fight in the alley with Bruce Lee and that karate dude was kind of like a homage to the guy with the beard and Enter the Dragon. Remember that guy that had the eye thing going on and they got beat up by Bruce Lee? I feel like that was like a homage to that because they almost got a guy that looked exactly like him. And then just just him coming out of nowhere and then fighting in the middle of an alley. I thought it was interesting. But then again, I was kind of like, I don't know if Bruce Lee would actually do this because I think Bruce Lee would have found a way to just kind of like try to talk his way out of it because I think the Bruce Lee philosophy is never go into a fight, just, go into fight, try to diffuse the fight first. And he didn't try to do that, and I was kind of thrown off by that, but I guess this is like the action version interpretation of, Bruce Lee, not the real life Bruce Lee. And that was fine. I was just kind of thought like he was going to give this speech about like, you don't want to fight me, you don't want to do this, but he just went in fighting. So I guess that was the kind of Bruce Lee they wanted to portray, and I guess that works for what this movie is. But I would say the last two fight sequences are probably the best ones. I like that Donnie Yen is actually like aging now. Because like I would say the third one, he still looked young as fuck, but now in this one they actually let him have the white hair and a little bit of the stubble, and he's not like smooth and clean looking as he was in the first movie. He's actually aging, which is good. And I did notice that he's a bit of a step slower, but again, that's kind of like the thing where athletes get older. You have to change your game anymore. You can't do the things you did when you were in your 20s. So in this case, even though he's like 59 in the movie or whatever, he's still doing the rapid punches, but it's not as fast, but he's doing them in like critical areas of the body where he knows where he can like do it effectively. And I noticed that in the fight at the end, and I was like, okay, they're kind of doing that thing that Jerome likes where in Creed 3 you pick a body part and work it, and he kind of like picked the open spots that he left them, because I guess Scott Adkins was leaving himself open to a lot of these spots. And he was just kind of picking them apart and doing the rapid punches. Again, his signature move. And they weren't as fast because he's 59 now. But it works because he's doing it like in critical areas of the body.
And he has cancer, apparently. So if he has cancer, all the more reason. And if you look at the age difference, like Yip Man would be in his 70s at this point. So I think that's also part of it, too.
Yeah, but I like the way they portrayed it because, again, even with the cancer thing, they incorporated that into the fight where he's got heavy breathing going on, and he wasn't experiencing that before. So that little detail I like because it does play into the fight. It's like you got to adapt now because obviously your lungs are not 100% as they were before. So you got to adapt because your cardio is not going to be the same. So I like those little details to the fight. But not everything else was as detailed in the movie though. But I just wish his son was there to watch the fight, if that makes sense. I feel like his son should be there for a lot of these fights, and he's just not there. And I felt like those are some missed opportunities because if he wants to be like his father, he should be there watching him fight, I feel.
I certainly don't disagree with you on that, and I think that's one of the weaknesses of the movie. Strengths, again, Donnie Yen consistently great. I think he's just as good in this movie, maybe even a little bit better, since he has to portray a little bit more vulnerability now that he has cancer. He does get to use a little bit of English as well because he's in the U.S., and I think that kind of adds some nuance. I think the fight scenes are better in this movie than the third movie. I think in terms of supporting cast, this is one of the better ones, which is weird because there's a lot of really bad ones too. But there's a lot of cast in this movie. Again, I'm a firm believer the nationalism makes for a better movie. And Brian, I have to get your thoughts. The ending montage. So we get a montage of Yip Man and training and fighting at the end. Like, we get clips of all 4 movies, and I wanted your thoughts on that.
Very Rocky-esque, very Rocky-esque. But did you notice how much of the footage they used per movie and how much of number 2 was used in the montage?
It felt like a lot of it was from number 2.
Yes, and that speaks to that sports entertainment aspect I was talking about. I think that look, if I were to like take a poll, I would say the consensus might be number 2 is like the fan favorite. That's just based on like the vibe I'm getting right now.
I think there's a lot of people who actually think the second one is the least good of the 4.
Really?
Yes.
Wow. Okay, I'm gonna look this up because that's the vibe I'm getting, and that's like, oh, they're clearly showing the fan favorite stuff of the series in this montage, and it's mostly from 2. So I was like, oh, they must really hold 2 on that regard. And then I mentioned in last week's podcast about Donnie Yen's feelings about the second one. He felt like it was going to be this like classic that was ready to like just be this classic movie, and he didn't want to like break that, and he ended up breaking it by doing 3. But I do feel like 2 is the standout, and I guess if, at this point, if we were going to do the rankings right now, for me it's 2-1, 2-1, 3-4. I think pretty much.
See, for me, it's 1, 2, 4, 3. I think 3 is easily the worst, and that's what makes this podcast fun. Is we get to disagree. I would say in terms of weaknesses, the arguing stuff in the first 15 minutes just doesn't go. The awkward accents, the use of English, feeling like it's going through a translator, the American, then the Japanese or the British. It's really strange.
Yeah, but for me, like the negatives, I think I've pretty much said them all. But I think the positive stuff was actually like small little scenes. Like I love the glass scene, where with the lazy Susan rolling glass, and they were pushing it against each other, and they're like. Everyone's telling me, you realize that this is going to break if you guys both push on this glass right now, and it just shatters. But that was a cool moment, and that was kind of like that clash of like, of what's to come. I thought that was good. Yeah, I mean, overall, I think I just like the 2 fights at the end. Even though, again, they were just demolishing all the other Kung Fu masters to make Wing Chun look good. But that's kind of where I'm at. I would give this a 5 out of 10, and maybe like Ip Man 3 I would give like a 6 out of 10, so that's kind of where I'm at in the last 2 movies. I did like Scott Adkins a lot. I'm going to say that right now. Like, I feel like, I don't know, he almost won the best performance category for me. He was really close, even though he was really playing that line of evil, goofy villain too much. But I felt like because he was able to like do the physicality of the role really well and have that physical, intimidating presence, and I don't know if it's just because I just watched John Wick 4 as well, but I think he's a really underappreciated actor that has only done like, like action movies or small action movies or kung fu movies or whatever. But he's learning, man. I felt like he really stepped up in John Wick 4, and this was 2019. So I think he's actually gotten better the last 2 or 3 years in terms of acting. But I don't know if that's just because of the character that he plays in John Wick 4 required him to do that kind of acting that brought out that great performance out of him that I thought he had. So in this case, he's not their best performance. I'm going to go with Donnie Yen, but he's really close. And I just thought it was weird that he beat up all the other people in the Notebook or whatever, that manual, which had nothing to do with the actual person that beat up his lieutenant or whatever. So again, the logic in these movies don't really flow well, especially if you're the bad guy.
Certainly. So we have had a chance to review for interesting Michelle Yeoh movies. Now we've kind of gone through the Ip Man series and gotten to explore Donnie Yen as a fighter, as a character. And next week we're going to return to Michelle Yeoh. We are going to do a bonus episode. We are going to be doing kind of an unofficial sequel to Yes Madam, and we are going to be doing what is an official sequel to The Heroic Trio. And we're going to just kind of do brief discussions of both movies because there are 5 movies in May, or 5 Tuesdays in May, I should say. We're just going to kind of go through these couple movies briefly. Next week will probably be a shorter episode because of that. Because, again, we're just going to highlight these 2 movies very briefly, and that's it. But we felt it was appropriate. I think you and I were very curious about these sequels. I guess one of them is a sequel. One of them is unofficial. But we were very curious to see kind of how these movies paid off anything that was done in the first movie.
Yeah, and Royal Assassins, which is the unofficial sequel to, In the Line of Fire, Yes Madam, whatever, it's got Hiroyuki Sanada. And I'm a big fan of his. And when I saw the trailer on YouTube randomly, like on the bus home, what was it, a month ago now, I saw this trailer, I'm like, dude, that is like super young Hiroyuki Sanada. That was just like, what the fuck is going on? So I'm watching this trailer, and apparently the plot line is that these 3 random, maybe not random, but like these 3 people thwart a bombing attempt on a plane, and the guy that set the bomb on the plane is trying to get revenge on them now because they thwarted the plan. And one of them is a cop, and Michelle Yeoh plays a cop. I think Hiroyuki Sanada's a cop, and I think the other guy is like some other dude. But there's some drama in that trailer that I was like really excited for, so I'm really looking forward to that. And Executioners sounds like a really depressing movie because, spoiler alert, it takes place after an apocalypse that takes place in between the 2 movies. So something happened, and it's got me thinking like, God, something either big happened or like some Thanos level event happened where they can't go back in time and fix it. So yeah, I'm kind of excited as to what's going down in Executioners because it seems like a downer, but maybe it's going to not be so much of a downer by the end.
For sure. That is a lot to look forward to next week. We will also talk about what we're doing in the month of June as well. It's going to be very, very exciting. So for Brian, my name is Jerome. Thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you again next week.
Man, too bad Scott Adkins didn't have a fat suit on. That would have been awesome.